The morning Abigail Ellsworth discovered that the last of the floorboards had rotted clean through. She was standing in her stockings with her left foot buried ankle-deep in cold Oklahoma dirt, and she had 3 children watching her from the doorway who did not need to see her cry. So she did not cry. She pulled her foot free, brushed the soil from her stocking, and said to the oldest child, 8-year-old Clara, "Go fetch the bread from the shelf and make sure your brothers eat before school." And then she walked out the back of the house into the thin October light of 1882 and pressed both hands flat against the rough exterior wall and breathed until the tightness in her chest loosened enough that she could think straight. The house had belonged to her brother, Thomas Ellsworth, and before him to their father. It sat on 40 acres of dry Oklahoma grassland just outside the small town of Morrow Crossing, and it had never been a fine house, not even in its best days. But Thomas had kept it standing through 7 years of marriage and hard work, and his wife, Sarah, had kept it warm and filled with the smell of baking bread. Then scarlet fever had come through the territory in the spring like a thief in the night, and in the space of 6 terrible days it had taken both Thomas and Sarah, leaving behind Clara, age 8, and the 2 boys, Eli, who was 6, and baby James, who was only 4. Abigail was 26 years old. She had been living in town, working as a seamstress out of a small rented room above the dry goods store. She had no husband, no land, and no particular plan for her future beyond the quiet hope that something decent might eventually come her way. When the fever took her brother and his wife, she packed everything she owned into a single trunk, closed up her rented room, and moved out to the farmhouse because there was nobody else. Thomas's neighbors were decent people, but they had their own children and their own struggles. The county would have sent Clara and Eli and James to an orphanage in the city, and Abigail would sooner have walked into the Arkansas River than let that happen. That had been 7 months ago. 7 months of learning how to feed 3 children on what a 40-acre dry grass farm produced, which was not much. 7 months of discovering that Thomas's debts were larger than anyone had known, that the horse was getting old, that the well needed work, and that the house itself was slowly, patiently, determinedly falling apart around them. The roof had leaked through the summer. 2 windows were covered with oilcloth instead of glass. And now the floor, which had been soft in places for a while, had finally given way entirely in the main room, so that there was nothing underfoot but bare packed earth and broken boards with rusty nail ends pointing up like warnings. Abigail went back inside and lifted the broken boards carefully, stacking them along the wall so at least nobody would step on a nail. The children ate their bread and watched her with quiet eyes. Clara was old enough to understand more than she let on. Eli watched everything with his father's serious expression. James mostly followed wherever Eli went and chewed his bread with dedicated concentration. "Is the floor going to be fixed?" Clara asked. "Yes," Abigail said, because she would not say anything else in front of them. She walked them to the schoolhouse that morning the way she always did, 1 mile down the packed dirt road into Morrow Crossing, and she smiled and waved when the teacher, Mrs. Gruber, opened the door and welcomed them in. Then she walked to the general store, which was owned by a heavyset man named Gerald Potts, who had been offering her credit for 3 months, and whose expression was beginning to grow the particular tightness that meant his patience was wearing thin. She did not go in for credit. She stood on the boardwalk and looked at the prices chalked on the slate board in the window and calculated in her head. Lumber was expensive. A good floor for the main room, maybe 16 by 18 feet, would cost money she did not have. The lumber yard at the edge of town was run by a man named Harlan, and Harlan was not the charitable type. She stood there long enough that Mrs. Carver, the pastor's wife, stopped beside her and said, "You all right, Abigail?" "Fine as can be," Abigail said, and straightened her spine and walked back toward the farm. She spent the afternoon doing the mending she took in from various households in Morrow Crossing. She was good with a needle and thread, always had been, and the few cents per job added up to something meaningful over the course of a week. She sat at the kitchen table, the only room that still had its original wooden floor intact, and she stitched and she thought, and she tried to work out how she could possibly afford lumber before winter set in properly, and turn the bare earth of the main room into something that would make the children truly sick. She was still thinking about it when she heard the wagon. It was a heavy sound, the slow grinding creak of iron wheels on dry road and the particular deep knock of a loaded flatbed, the kind of wagon that carried serious weight. She looked out the window and saw it coming up the long drive from the road, a bay horse pulling steadily, and on the seat a man she did not recognize. He was broad-shouldered and unhurried in the way he held the reins, wearing a dark hat and a canvas work coat the color of dust. He had dark hair and a jaw that looked like it had been cut rather than grown, and he was perhaps a year or two older than she was, somewhere in his late 20s. He brought the wagon to a stop in the yard, looped the reins, and stepped down with the easy movement of someone accustomed to working in his body. Abigail was already at the door. "Can I help you?" she said. He looked up at her from under the brim of his hat, and she saw that his eyes were a very clear gray, the color of a sky just before rain. "Abigail Ellsworth," he said. "That is correct." "Name is Levi Hayes. I bought the Stratton place 3 miles east." He gestured loosely in the direction of the road. "I was in town yesterday picking up supplies, and Gerald Potts mentioned you might have need of some lumber." He said it simply, as though that explained everything. Abigail looked at him. Then she looked at the wagon. The back of it was stacked with good pine boards, straight-cut and fresh-smelling even from where she stood. There was enough to floor the entire main room and possibly the hallway beyond. "Gerald Potts had no business mentioning anything of the sort," she said. Levi Hayes did not look offended. He looked at the house, at the sagging porch, and then back at her with those gray eyes that were careful and direct. "Maybe not," he said, "but I had the lumber, had more cut than I needed for the Stratton place." "I cannot pay for it," Abigail said. She said it flat and without apology because she had learned that apologizing for poverty only made it worse. "I know," he said. The simplicity of his answer stopped her. Most people, when she stated a fact like that, felt obliged to say something that made them feel better about either her poverty or their own charity. He simply acknowledged it and stood there, waiting. "Why would you bring it then?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of someone searching for a convenient answer, but the silence of someone accustomed to saying what he meant. "Because I drove past your house 3 times in the past 2 weeks, he said, "and each time I could see through the window that the floor was getting worse. And because my mother raised me to help when help was needed and not to wait to be asked." He paused. "Also because winter comes hard out here and dirt floors in November will make those children sick." Abigail stood very still. Something was happening in her chest that she was not going to examine closely in front of a stranger. She looked at the lumber again. She looked at the man. "I am not a charity case," she said. "No," he agreed. "You are a woman raising 3 children on a broken-down farm with one mending income and a leaking roof. That is not the same thing." She had no answer for that, so she stepped back from the door and said, "I will make coffee." They drank coffee at the kitchen table, and she asked him direct questions the way she did everything, and he answered them the same way. He was 29 years old. He had come from Missouri, where his family had a farm, but he was the second of 4 sons, and the Stratton land had come up for a reasonable price, and he had wanted his own start. He had been a carpenter before farming, and before that he had worked alongside his father building barns and houses throughout the Missouri Valley. He had been in Oklahoma for 6 weeks. "You have a wife?" she asked. "No," he said. "Family here. Just the land," he said. She poured more coffee and studied him across the table. He did not fidget under her gaze, which she noted and appreciated. Many men grew uncomfortable when a woman looked at them as though she were actually seeing them. "The children will be home at 3, she said. "If you are going to lay that floor, you had better start." Something shifted in his expression, the smallest change, like sunlight moving across still water. "Yes, ma'am," he said. He worked for the rest of that afternoon and well into the evening. Abigail worked beside him, holding boards steady while he nailed them, passing tools, moving furniture out of the way. She was not the sort of woman who stood back and watched while work was being done. He seemed to understand this without being told, and he did not make comments about it or look surprised. He simply made room for her on the work side of things, and they fell into a rhythm that felt, in some undefinable way, familiar. The children came home from school to find the yard full of lumber and a stranger on his knees in the main room with a hammer. Clara stopped in the doorway. Eli leaned around Clara's shoulder. James pressed forward between them with the boundless forward momentum of 4-year-olds. "Who is that?" Eli said. "Mr. Levi Hayes," Abigail said. "He is laying the floor." "Why?" said Clara. "Because it needed doing," Abigail said. Levi looked up from where he was kneeling and nodded to the children in a serious way as though they were people of consequence, which they were. "Evening," he said. "Evening," said Clara, a little cautious. "Can I help?" said Eli immediately. "Sure," said Levi, and that was that. Eli was kneeling beside him within 3 minutes, holding boards in place with a solemnity that the job deserved, and Levi treated his assistance as though it were actually useful, which mostly it was. James, who was too small to help with lumber, attached himself to Abigail's side and watched with enormous eyes. They ate supper together, the 4 of them and Levi Hayes, because Abigail was not going to let a man work that hard in her house and then send him home without a meal. She made salt pork and bean stew and cornbread, and there was just enough of everything if she served herself less, which she did without comment. Levi noticed, she thought, but he did not say anything, which was the right choice. Clara warmed to him by the end of the meal. She was a child who observed carefully and came to her own conclusions, and her conclusion about Levi Hayes was apparently a cautiously favorable one, because she asked him 3 questions about Missouri in the studied way. She asked questions when she was actually interested in the answers. He stayed until the floor in the main room was half done and the light had gone too thin to work safely. He covered the unfinished section with canvas so the children would not catch splinters in the night. "I will come back Saturday," he said at the door. "You do not have to," Abigail said. "I know," he said, in the same tone he had used that afternoon. She watched him drive the wagon back down the road in the dark, and then she went inside and stood on the new pine floor, which smelled clean and bright and like something beginning. He came back Saturday. He finished the main room and started on the hallway. He brought more boards than were needed for just the hallway, which meant he had measured the rooms in his head on his first visit and known exactly what the whole job would require. That Saturday, while he worked, Abigail baked. She made a proper pie from the last of the dried apples she had been saving, and she made a double batch of biscuits and a pot of rabbit stew from the 2 rabbits Eli had snared that week. It was the best meal she had made in months, because for the first time in months she felt that there was something worth cooking for beyond simple necessity. She noticed that feeling and was mildly alarmed by it, because it seemed to be connected to the man currently nailing boards to her hallway floor. They talked more that day. She learned that his mother had died 2 years ago and his father had remarried quickly, and the new wife was decent enough, but the shape of the family had changed in ways that felt permanent. She told him about Thomas, about the fever, about the morning she had arrived at this farm and found 3 small frightened children and a house that was already beginning to show its age. "Were you close with your brother?" he asked. "Very," she said. "We were only 2 years apart. He was the kind of person who remembered everyone's birthday and showed up without being asked." She paused. "Like some people I have recently met." Levi looked at her across the distance of the hallway. The hint of a smile crossed his face, just brief enough to be real. "I suppose that is a compliment," he said. "It is the highest one I know how to give," she said. That evening, after the children were in bed, they sat on the porch in the cool October dark and drank the last of the coffee. The sky over the Oklahoma plain was enormous and salted with stars. In the distance, a coyote called and was answered. "I meant to ask," Levi said, "about the roof." "What about it?" she said, though she knew what about it. "It has 4 bad patches on the north side. I noticed when I drove in." "I know about the roof," she said. "I have shingles at the Stratton place," he said. "Mr. Hayes," she said. "Levi," he said. She looked at him. "Levi, you have already laid most of my floor. You cannot fix my roof." "The floor took 2 Saturdays," he said. "The roof would take 1, maybe 2 more. Then you would go into winter without a leak." "And what would I do in exchange?" she asked. She was not asking to be provocative. She genuinely wanted to understand the arithmetic of what he was proposing, because in her experience nothing came without a cost, and she preferred to know what the cost was. He thought about it, which she appreciated. "Next spring when I plant," he said finally. "I have not done vegetable gardening before, only field crops. My mother always did the kitchen garden. If you were willing to advise on that, I would consider it a fair trade." She looked at him for a long moment. It was a very sensible answer. It was the kind of answer that suggested he had been thinking about how to make this feel less like charity and more like a reasonable arrangement between neighbors, and the fact that he had thought about that said something about him. "That is a fair trade," she said. He came back the following 2 Saturdays and fixed the roof. The first Saturday he brought Eli up on the roof with him, because Eli had asked in his serious way if he could help, and Levi had assessed the boy with gray eyes and said he could carry shingles. Eli carried shingles with the focused dedication of someone who had been given an important assignment. Abigail watched from the yard with James beside her, shading her eyes against the thin November sun, and she watched Levi Hayes on her roof and felt something she had not felt in a very long time. It was warmth, but not the physical kind. It was the feeling of being looked after, and it was simultaneously wonderful and frightening because she had learned not to rely on it. By the second Saturday the roof was sound. Levi stood in the yard and looked up at it with the critical eye of a man assessing his own work, and Abigail stood beside him. "It will hold," he said. "Thank you," she said. She said it simply because she meant it simply. "I do not know what we would have done going into winter with that leak." "You would have managed," he said. "You manage everything." "Not everything," she said quietly, and he looked at her sideways and she looked away at the horizon. He began coming on Sundays too, not always with tools. Sometimes he came after the morning church service, which she attended with the children, and he would fall into step beside her on the road home, and they would walk and talk while the children ran ahead through the dry grass. Clara had entirely dropped her initial wariness. Eli treated Levi with the serious respect he reserved for people he considered important. James had taken to reaching up and taking Levi's hand when they walked, the way small children do when they have decided that someone is safe. The first time James did it, Levi looked down at the small hand in his and said nothing. He just held it carefully and kept walking. Abigail looked away because her eyes had done something embarrassing. November deepened into cold and then into the particular sharp December cold of the Oklahoma plain, where the wind came off the open land with nothing to stop it. The new floor made a profound difference. The house held warmth better without the cold earth breathing up through the gaps in the old boards. The children slept warmer, and Abigail no longer woke at 3 in the morning with the particular low-grade dread she had been feeling since she arrived. Levi began bringing things. Not large things, not dramatic gestures, just the practical small gifts of a man who paid attention. A bag of sugar when he knew her supply was low, because he had noticed she had not put any in her coffee the previous Sunday. A rabbit snare better made than Eli's, which he taught the boy to set. A pound of dried beans. Once he brought a rocking chair that he had made himself, carved from oak and so well proportioned that it fit the kitchen corner as though it had always lived there. "You made this," she said, running her hand along the smooth arm. "Sunday evenings," he said. "I have time in the evenings." She looked at the chair and looked at him and thought about him sitting alone in the Stratton house on Sunday evenings carving a chair for her kitchen, and was not entirely sure what to do with that thought. "I cannot keep accepting things from you," she said. "You are not accepting things," he said. "I am leaving them. That is different." "Is it?" "The chair came from wood I had left over. The sugar was an extra pound I bought because I wanted to. The beans were from my own stores and I have plenty. He held her gaze steadily. I am not keeping score, Abigail. I do not want you to feel indebted. I want you to have a rocking chair and enough sugar in your coffee. She sat in the rocking chair. It fit her exactly. She rocked once, forward and back, and the motion was smooth and even, and the oak was warm and solid. Sit down, she said, because she needed to say something that was not the thing she was actually thinking. I will make tea. The Christmas of 1882 was the first one Abigail had spent since she was a child in anything resembling genuine warmth. Not because she had money, she did not, but because Levi brought a small spruce he had cut from the north edge of his land and helped the children decorate it with strings of dried berries and paper shapes Clara had cut with patient scissors. He brought peppermint sticks, one for each child and one for Abigail, and he brought a side of smoked pork that was more meat than the farm had seen in months. They cooked together all Christmas morning, Abigail and Levi in the kitchen, the children underfoot, and then not underfoot, and then underfoot again, with the restless Christmas energy of children who have been given a small gift of hope. Clara helped with the cornbread. Eli and James made more of a mess than was strictly necessary and laughed about it. And it was the first time Abigail had heard James laugh in a way that reached all the way to his eyes since before his parents died. She was standing at the stove stirring gravy when she felt her throat tighten in the particular dangerous way that meant tears were near, and she kept stirring and focused on the gravy until the moment passed. Levi was at the table cutting bread. He did not look at her, which was considerate of him, but she had the sense that he knew. After the meal, after the children were bundled in the other room with their peppermint sticks, Levi and Abigail sat at the kitchen table with the good silence of two people who have spent a full day in close company and found no gaps in it. This was a good Christmas, she said. Yes, he said. For the children, I mean. For the children, he agreed, and then after a pause, and for me. She looked at him. He looked back. The kitchen was warm from the stove, and outside the wind was coming off the plain with its December teeth, and inside the house smelled like pine and pork and warm bread, and Abigail Ellsworth looked at Levi Hayes and understood, with a clarity that was almost alarming, that she was in very real danger of loving this man. She looked away first. More coffee, she said. Please, he said, as though that was the only thing either of them had been talking about. January came in hard. 3 days of ice that kept everyone close to the stove and made the roads treacherous. Levi rode out on his bay horse 2 days into the ice storm, appearing at the door in his heavy coat with snow in his hat, and Abigail did not ask him why he had ridden 3 miles in an ice storm or tell him he should not have done it. She just let him in and took his coat and hung it by the stove to dry. He stayed 2 days, sleeping on the new floor with a blanket because the ice made traveling back impossible. The children treated this as a great adventure. Eli insisted on teaching Levi to play the card game Thomas had taught him, and Levi learned it with patient good humor and lost 4 hands in a row while Eli beamed with competitive satisfaction. On the second evening of the ice storm, after the children were asleep, Levi sat in the kitchen with Abigail and said, I want to tell you something. All right, she said. He was quiet for a moment in his thoughtful way. I came to Oklahoma because I needed a start, he said. My own start. I had a plan for it that was pretty clear in my head. Get the land, build it up, get it producing. That was most of the plan. And, she said, because the pause required it. The plan did not include meeting someone, he said. But plans change. Abigail set down the mug she was holding. Levi, she said. I know, he said. I know you are raising 3 children and managing a farm and taking in mending, and you have enough on your mind. I'm not asking you for anything tonight. I'm only telling you what is true so that you know it. She looked at him across the table. The lamp between them was low and the kitchen was quiet and the ice was tapping at the window glass. What is true? She said softly. That you are the most remarkable person I have met in my life, he said, and that I think about this house and the people in it when I am at the Stratton place alone, and that I am not at all sorry I brought that lumber. The honesty of it, The plain, uncomplicated honesty of it was what got her. She had been braced for something more complicated, something that would require her to be cautious or clever, and instead he had just said the truth in the simplest possible words. "I think about you too," she said. It cost her something to say it because she was not naturally a woman who opened doors like that. But he had opened his, and it seemed only right. He did not move toward her or press the moment further. He just nodded, as though she had confirmed something he had been fairly certain of but had needed to hear. And then he said, "Good night, Abigail," and she said, "Good night, Levi," and they went to their separate sleeping places, and the ice continued to tap at the window. In February, Gerald Potts at the general store extended her credit again, and this time she took it without argument because the children needed new boots, and the cold was not going to wait on her pride. She was in the store selecting the boots when she heard two women talking in the next aisle over. Their voices dropped to the particular register that meant they thought they were not being heard. "She's been taking his help for months," said the first voice, which belonged to Margaret Crane, whose husband ran the feed store. "Lumber and shingles and food, from what I hear, and him out there every Sunday." "Well, she has no husband," said the second voice, which was Harriet Cole, who was 70 years old and had opinions about everything. "What else is she to do? A decent woman would find a way that did not involve relying so heavily on a single man's charity," Margaret Crane said. "People are talking." Abigail stood very still in the next aisle with 3 pairs of children's boots in her arms. Her face was perfectly composed. Inside, something had tightened like a rope pulled to its limit. She took the boots to the counter and looked Gerald Potts in the eye and said, "Add these to my credit, please," in a voice that was steady as stone. Then she walked out of the store and down the boardwalk and into the thin February cold and kept walking until she was clear of town. She was not ashamed. She refused to be ashamed. But she was angry, and beneath the anger she was something more complicated, because she knew that in this world of 1882, in this small town, a woman's reputation was a fragile and important thing, not for the sake of her own pride, but for the sake of the children she was raising. If people talked badly enough, if the wrong sort of story attached itself to her name, it could make everything harder. It could affect which families gave her mending work. It could affect how the schoolteacher looked at Clara and Eli and James. When Levi came Sunday, she told him what she had heard. She did it directly and without theatrics because she wanted him to understand the situation fully, and she trusted him to respond to facts. He listened. His jaw was tight by the end. "I will stay away," he said, "if that is what you need." "I do not want you to stay away," she said, and was surprised by her own vehemence. He looked at her. "Then tell me what you want." The question sat between them in the cold kitchen air. Outside, the children were in the yard making noise about something with a stick and a tin can. "I want what is right for those children," she said. "And I want—" She stopped. "What?" he said very quietly. "I want not to lose what has been growing between us," she said. "Whatever it is." He was across the kitchen before she had quite finished the sentence, not rushing, not dramatic, just moving with the deliberate intention she was coming to know as characteristic of him. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she could see the gray of his eyes clearly. "Then I think there is a practical solution," he said. "Which is?" "Marry me," he said. It was not the most elaborate proposal in the history of the territory. It was 3 words delivered with the same directness he applied to everything. And then he added, because he was not quite as simple as he sometimes appeared, "I have thought about this since December, and it is not a question born of what those women said in the store. It is a question I was always going to ask you. They just moved the timing." She stared at him. "We have known each other 4 months, she said. "Yes," he said. "You would be taking on 3 children," she said. "I know," he said. "I have been here for them for 4 months. I did not stop thinking of them as mine when I drove home each Sunday." That word, mine, delivered with such quiet certainty, did something to her that she would not be able to fully describe later. It was as though a wall she had built so gradually, she had not noticed it going up, had simply come down. "You should know," she said. her voice slightly unsteady in a way she was not proud of, "that I am not an easy woman. I have opinions and I state them, and I am not going to spend my life deferring to you on matters I know more about." "Lord forbid," he said, and the humor in it was warm and true. "And I cannot promise that this farm will ever be what it should be, or that the debts will clear quickly, or that things will be, Abigail," he said. "Yes. I'm a carpenter and a farmer with 3 miles of good Oklahoma land and more timber than I know what to do with. I think we will be fine." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Yes." He let out a breath, a real one, as though he had been holding it without knowing it. He raised one hand and very carefully, very deliberately, tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, and the touch was so gentle for such a large-boned, capable hand that she nearly undid herself entirely. "Good," he said. They were married in the Morrow Crossing Church on the 15th of March, 1883, with Reverend Collins officiating and the children in the front pew, and about 30 people from town filling the rest of the benches, including Margaret Crane, who had come to see and stayed to cry, which Abigail found both amusing and satisfying. Clara wore a blue ribbon that Abigail had sewn into her hair. Eli polished his boots to a very serious shine. James fell asleep during the vows and had to be held by Mrs. Carver, the pastor's wife, which made the whole congregation smile. Levi stood at the front of the church in his best coat, which was dark wool and fit him well, and when Abigail came down the aisle, there was something in his face that she had never seen in anyone's face before in her life, not directed at her. She had to look at the floor for a moment to collect herself. They spoke their vows clearly and without stumbling. When Reverend Collins said they were married, Levi took both her hands and held them as though they were something precious, and kissed her once, warmly, in front of the whole congregation. Outside afterward, in the thin March sunshine, while the children ran circles around them and various neighbors offered congratulations, Abigail stood beside her husband, which was a word she was still adjusting to, and thought that the morning 7 months ago when she had stood behind the house with her hands flat against the wall breathing through her grief and her exhaustion and her terror, she could not have imagined this. They moved to the Stratton place together. It was a better house than the Ellsworth farm, bigger and sturdier, with a proper floor throughout and a barn that was reasonably sound. Levi had spent his 6 weeks of solitary occupancy making improvements, and it showed. The kitchen was well organized and the windows were all intact, and the fireplace in the main room drew properly. They kept the Ellsworth farm. It was Thomas's land, and one day it would belong to Clara and Eli and James. For now, Levi brought his farming knowledge to it, and Abigail brought her knowledge of what 40 acres of that particular Oklahoma soil could produce, and together they began working both pieces of land, which was ambitious but not impossible. The children settled into the new house with the adaptability of children who have already survived the worst disruption of their lives, and know that a house is defined by who is in it. Clara transferred her school things to the new room with methodical efficiency. Eli immediately located the best rabbit-snaring spots in the new property surroundings. James slept his first night in the new house between his brother and sister in the big bed and said the next morning at breakfast, "This house is better." "Is it?" Abigail said. "Because you are not worried here," James said, with the devastating perceptiveness of 4-year-olds. Abigail looked at him and then at Levi and said nothing, because there was nothing to add to that. Spring came to Oklahoma with the particular extravagance of a season that has been a long time coming. The grass greened overnight, it seemed, and the sky went from its winter white to a deep and particular blue, and everything smelled like wet earth and possibility. Abigail had promised to help with the kitchen garden, and she kept her promise thoroughly. She knew Oklahoma soil from 7 months of working the Ellsworth farm, and she knew what would grow and what would not, and in what order to plant it. She walked the south side of the property with Levi one April morning, both of them looking at the sun angles and the drainage and the soil composition in the way farmers read the land, and she pointed out what she would do, and he asked questions that showed he understood more than she had expected, and they argued mildly but productively about the placement of the tomato rows. And it was, she thought, one of the best conversations she had had in years. He built her a proper kitchen garden fence, rabbits being what they were on the Oklahoma plain. He made it tight and high enough to be effective, and he made the gate so that it swung without catching. And when he was done, she stood at the gate and looked at the fenced-off piece of turned earth and felt, for a moment, as though she had been handed something that had always been hers. They planted together, she and Levi and the children, on a Saturday in mid-April, all 5 of them in the garden with their hands in the dark soil. James got dirt on his face and in his hair and looked entirely satisfied about this. Clara planted her rows with mathematical precision. Eli found 2 worms of impressive size and wanted to keep them, which was briefly debated and ultimately declined. Levi was kneeling in the dirt putting in bean seeds when Abigail looked at him, really looked at him, this man with good Oklahoma soil on his hands, and his hat pushed back and 3 children crawling around him like he had always been there, and she felt something so full and complete that it almost hurt. He looked up and caught her looking. Neither of them said anything. He just held her gaze for a moment with those clear gray eyes and then went back to the beans, and she went back to the tomato seedlings, and the children went on being children. That evening, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, they sat on the porch that Levi had extended and reinforced the previous week, because the original porch had been narrow and he liked to sit outside in the evenings. The Oklahoma night spread out around them, enormous and soft with stars. "The garden is going to be good this year," she said. "Better than good," he said. They were quiet for a while. The coyotes were calling in the distance, the usual evening conversation of the open land. "I am happy," she said. She said it as though she was reporting a fact because she was. "I did not know if I would be after everything. I thought maybe happiness was the kind of thing you get or you do not get, and I had gotten my share early and then it was done." She paused. "I was wrong about that." Levi reached over in the dark and found her hand and held it on the arm of the porch bench. "I am glad you were wrong," he said. She turned her hand over and held his, and they sat like that in the warm April dark for a long time. Summer arrived, and with it the hard work of 2 farms in their planting and growing season. They hired a young man named Pete Dawson, 17 and eager, from a family with too many sons and not enough land, to help with the field work at the Ellsworth property. Abigail drove out there 3 days a week to oversee things, and Levi went every Saturday. The Ellsworth house itself was locked and maintained, the floors gleaming, the roof sound, waiting for the day the children would be grown enough to decide what they wanted of their inheritance. Clara had by now become Abigail's deliberate apprentice in all matters of house management, not because Abigail imposed it, but because Clara had her father's practical disposition, and she wanted to know how things worked. She was 9 years old, and she already baked passable biscuits, and could mend a simple tier, and knew how to string the laundry line, so the weight of the wet clothes was evenly distributed. Abigail taught her everything she knew without sentimentality, and with great respect for Clara's intelligence. Eli and Levi had developed a relationship that Abigail watched with a careful and grateful heart. It had grown gradually, the way real things grow, through the accumulated weight of shared work and small conversation, and the particular bond that forms between a man and a boy when they are both serious about the same things. Eli helped with the barn animals and was learning to mend harness leather, and had twice gone with Levi to the lumber yard in town on the kind of errands that involved adult conversation and the handling of money, which Eli treated with the gravity such things deserved. James was simply devoted. He followed Levi when Levi was on the property, and sat in the kitchen with Abigail when Levi was not, and asked questions that began with, "When is Levi coming back?" with a frequency that was endearing and occasionally exhausting. One August evening, Levi came inside from the barn to find James sitting at the kitchen table drawing something on a piece of paper with a stick of charcoal. "What are you drawing?" Levi asked. Our family, James said. Levi looked at the drawing. It was a house, large and somewhat wobbly, with 5 stick figures in front of it of varying heights. The tallest was clearly meant to be Levi. Beside it was a somewhat shorter figure with a triangular dress shape, which was Abigail, then 3 smaller figures. That is a fine drawing, Levi said. Will you always be here? James asked in the sudden direct way of children who have lost people. Levi sat down at the table beside the boy. Yes, he said. This is my home and you are my family. I am not going anywhere. James looked at him for a moment with Thomas Ellsworth's serious brown eyes in a 4-year-old's face. Then he went back to his drawing and added a sun above the house with many rays extending outward. Abigail had been in the doorway. She stepped back out before either of them saw her, and stood in the hallway with one hand pressed flat against the wall, very much like she had stood against the outside wall of the Ellsworth house the morning the floor gave way. Only now the thing pressing against her chest from the inside was not grief or exhaustion or terror. It was something else entirely. In September, at the beginning of autumn, Abigail realized she was expecting a child. She spent 3 days being privately certain before she told Levi, because she was a woman who liked to be sure of things before she put them into words. She told him on a Sunday morning while the children were getting ready for church, dropping her voice to a quiet register in the kitchen while Clara braided her own hair in the next room and Eli looked for his good hat. Levi went very still. He was holding his coffee cup and he set it down very carefully. "A baby," he said. "Yes," she said. He looked at her for a long moment, and the expression on his face was something she would remember for the rest of her life. Pure and uncomplicated joy, the kind that does not know how to contain itself and does not bother trying. He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and held her face in both hands and kissed her forehead and then her cheek, and then said against her temple, "That is the best news I have ever heard in my life." "You may want to consider that statement carefully," she said, though her voice was not entirely steady. "I have considered it," he said. Clara appeared in the doorway, braids complete, and looked at them with the sharp perception of a 9-year-old who has understood for some time that grown-up communication has layers. "What happened?" she said. Abigail stepped back from Levi and smoothed her dress and said, "You are going to have a cousin." Clara stared. "A baby." "In the spring," Abigail said. Clara's expression went through several phases rapidly. Surprise, calculation, and then a slow spreading smile that was so much like Thomas's that it made Abigail's chest ache with love and grief at the same time. "I have always wanted a baby," Clara said, with the proprietary satisfaction of someone who considers this development to be primarily a gift to herself. "Good," Levi said, "because you are going to be a considerable help." Eli, hat located, appeared behind Clara and was given the information with the same directness. He nodded seriously. "Will it be a boy?" he asked. "We will find out in spring," Abigail said. James was last because he was 4 and getting his boots on was an enterprise. When told that there was going to be a baby, he thought about it, then said, "Where is it now?" which required a brief and carefully worded explanation that Abigail felt she handled rather well under the circumstances. The news ran through the town of Morrow Crossing in the way news did in small towns of that era, which was quickly and with embellishment. Gerald Potts at the general store offered Abigail an additional credit line, which she declined politely. Mrs. Carver, the pastor's wife, organized a small quilting circle that produced a crib quilt of considerable beauty. Margaret Crane appeared at the door one October afternoon with a crock of her preserved plums and stayed for tea and was entirely pleasant, and Abigail concluded that the woman was not genuinely bad-hearted, only small-minded, which was a different kind of problem. The autumn was good. The garden had produced magnificently, and Abigail put up enough vegetables to last the winter with careful management. The grain harvest from both farms was better than the previous year. Pete Dawson had proved himself worth keeping on, and Levi had offered him a small wage increase and the use of the old Ellsworth Properties barn to house his own horse, which Pete's family could not otherwise stable through winter, and the arrangement worked well for everyone. Levi built a crib. He built it from white oak, smooth to a satiny finish, with carved corner posts that had a simple vine pattern running up them. It was the best piece of furniture Abigail had ever seen outside of a catalog. When he brought it in and set it in the corner of their room, she ran her hand along the carved post and said, "Levi." "Yes," he said. "You are going to make me cry, and I have managed not to do that in front of anyone for most of the year, and I would like to maintain that record." He looked at her with those gray eyes warm with something that had no name she could put on it. "My mother used to say that tears were not weakness," he said. "They were just the overflow of a full heart." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she cried, briefly and without embarrassment, and he held her, and it was entirely fine. Winter came again, the second winter she had known in Oklahoma, and this time she went into it without dread. The floors were sound. The roof was sound. The larder was full. The children were healthy and growing, and she could hear them in the evenings doing their school lessons at the kitchen table while she sat in the oak rocking chair, and her belly grew, and Levi read the newspaper he brought from town once a week, and the house breathed warmly around them all. She had thought once that this kind of ordinary life was something that happened to other people who had made different choices or been handed different luck or been born to better circumstances. She had not been bitter about it exactly, but she had accepted a kind of quiet resignation as the appropriate response to a world that was frequently hard and occasionally brutal, and that did not often give women like her much room to expect more. She had been wrong about that too, it turned out. Christmas of 1883 was larger than the year before. Levi brought a bigger tree. Clara had learned to bake an actual pie, and produced one with a flaky crust and a filling of preserved peach that was genuinely good. Eli had carved a small horse figure for James, working at it for 6 weeks in the evenings with the pocket knife Levi had given him in the autumn, and the horse had proportionate legs and a recognizable mane, and Eli was quietly but visibly proud of it. James received the horse with the reverence of someone receiving a sacred object. Mrs. Carver and Reverend Collins came to dinner. Gerald Potts and his wife came. Pete Dawson came, and several other neighbors whose proximity had grown into actual friendship over the course of the year. The house was full in a way it had probably never been full before, not even in Thomas and Sarah's time, and Abigail stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at it all and felt such a profound and almost bewildering sense of gratitude that she had to take a moment to be alone with it. Levi found her there. He came and stood beside her and looked at what she was looking at, the full house, the firelight, the children running between the adult legs, and he put his arm around her shoulders. "All right," he said. "More than all right," she said. "Good," he said, and kissed her hair. The baby came in late April of 1884, right at the turning of the season, which felt appropriate. It was a long labor, as first labors often were, and the midwife, a competent and reassuring woman named Mrs. Holliday, who had delivered most of the babies in the Morrow Crossing area for 15 years, arrived in the early morning and did not leave until the late evening. Levi spent the day in a state that he tried to conceal from the children with mixed success. He fixed things that did not need fixing. He reorganized the barn twice. He made coffee and forgot to drink it, and then made more. Eli, observing all of this, concluded that waiting was harder than working and said so, which Levi agreed with fully. Clara was inside, assisting Mrs. Holliday with the calm efficiency she brought to everything, carrying things and heating water, and being useful with the steady practicality of a child who has already learned that crises are best met with action. The baby arrived as the sun was going down, filling the bedroom with the last of the April light, and he was a boy, solid and loud and emphatically present in the way of all new arrivals who have decided that the world should know they are here. Levi came in when Mrs. Holliday called him, and he stood at the bedside and looked at Abigail and the infant, and Abigail had never in her life seen a man look like that. as though the world had rearranged itself into an arrangement more correct than anything he had known before. "A boy," she said. "I can see that," he said, in a voice that was not quite level. "Do you want to hold him?" He sat carefully on the edge of the bed, and she transferred the baby into his arms, and Levi Hayes held his son with the same careful deliberateness he brought to everything, and the baby blinked in the golden light and yawned, which caused a sound from Levi that was not quite a laugh and not quite a word. They named him Thomas James Hayes, the first name for the brother. The middle name for the boy who had claimed Levi's hand on those Sunday walks, and who was now 5 years old and mightily proud to have his name incorporated into the new baby's. Clara was allowed to hold the baby first among the children by virtue of seniority, and she held him with a precision and gentleness that made Mrs. Holliday nod approvingly. Eli looked at his infant cousin or brother, the word had become flexible in this family, and said that his nose was very small, which it was. James peered at the baby for a long time and then looked up at Abigail with serious eyes and said, "He has your eyes." "He does," she agreed. "That is good," James said, "because your eyes are nice." And this was so entirely Thomas's manner of speaking, direct and affectionate without self-consciousness, that Abigail had to look away for a moment. The months that followed were full in the way that months with a new baby are full, which is to say they were somewhat exhausting and profoundly rewarding, and time moved differently than it had before. Clara took on more household responsibility with evident satisfaction. Eli helped with the outdoor chores in the early mornings, so that Levi could spend more time close to home during the weeks when Abigail was most tired. James was a devoted and slightly interfering presence in the baby's life, providing a running commentary on everything the baby did and did not do. Levi was, Abigail observed, the same with the baby as he was with all 3 of the other children. Present, steady, genuinely interested. He got up in the nights without being asked when the baby cried, which she had not expected, and which she received with the complicated gratitude of a woman who has spent a long time doing everything alone. He changed diapers with the practical competence of someone who considers no task beneath him, if it needs doing. He talked to young Thomas the way you talk to a person, not in the artificial high voice that some people used with infants, but in his actual quiet voice, giving the baby full credit for understanding. The summer of 1884 was the best farming year the combined properties had produced. The kitchen garden overflowed. The grain fields at the Ellsworth farm produced a harvest that paid off the last of Thomas's debts, which Levi and Abigail paid together at the bank in Morrow Crossing in August. And when the banker confirmed the account was settled, Abigail felt something release in her chest that she had not known was still there. She said nothing about it until they were outside, blinking in the August sun with the baby on her hip and Levi beside her, and then she said, "It is done." "Yes," he said, "all of it, his debts are cleared." "Yes," he said again. She turned to look at him and the sunlight was very bright and her eyes were wet, though she had promised herself she was done crying in public. "He would have hated knowing," she said. "Thomas, he was so proud, he would have hated that he left things in a state." "He also would have hated the idea of his children not being loved," Levi said, "and they are, so I think overall he would consider it a fair account." She looked at him for a moment. Then she reached up and kissed him, right there on the boardwalk in front of the bank, in front of anyone who happened to be passing, which several people were. From behind them she heard Eli make a brief sound of protest at such a public display, and Clara make a sound of tolerant amusement and James say, to no one in particular, "They always do that." The fall of 1884 brought with it something Abigail had not been anticipating, which was Clara approaching her one September evening after the younger children were in bed with a piece of paper and her father's serious expression. "I want to talk to you about something," Clara said. "All right," Abigail said, and she and Levi exchanged a glance over Clara's head because she was 10 years old now and had opinions about things in a way that deserved to be taken seriously. Clara put the paper on the table. It was covered in her careful handwriting. "I have been thinking about the Ellsworth farm," she said, "and about Eli and James, and about what we want to do with it." She paused. "I think we should keep farming it ourselves instead of just having Pete Dawson there. I think we are old enough to be more involved, and I think Father would have wanted us to know how it works." Abigail looked at the paper, which was a list of arguments in Clara's hand, thoughtfully organized. She looked at this 10-year-old who had her father's practicality and her mother's warmth, and had somehow in the past year and a half grown into a young person of genuine substance. "I think you are right," Abigail said. Clara blinked, having clearly prepared for more argument. "You do?" "I think it is exactly right," Abigail said, "and I think we should talk to Eli and James and make a plan." Levi was already nodding. "Next spring," he said, "we teach all three of you the planting end to end, not just carrying things, the whole thing." Clara looked between them with an expression that was trying very hard to remain serious and not quite managing it. "Good," she said, with great dignity. Then she gathered her paper and went to bed, and from the doorway they could see her putting the paper carefully in the small wooden box where she kept her important things. "She is extraordinary," Levi said quietly. "She is Thomas's daughter," Abigail said. "She is yours too," he said. The winter of 1884 into 1885 was gentler than the previous ones. Young Thomas grew from an infant who simply existed into a small person, who had decided he had things to say, and began saying them in a language that was mostly intelligible to his immediate family and mysterious to everyone else. He had Levi's gray eyes and Abigail's dark hair and Clara's determined jaw, and nobody could quite explain that last part, except that families have a way of mixing themselves together in unexpected patterns. On an evening in January, while snow fell softly outside and the children were all in bed, Abigail and Levi sat by the fire in the main room, and she had her mending and he had a piece of wood he was working into something small. She could not yet tell what, and the fire cracked and settled and the wind outside was quiet. "Do you ever miss Missouri?" she asked. He considered the question honestly. "Sometimes," he said. "My brothers, the way the land looked in May." "But missing something is not the same as wanting to go back to it." He glanced at her. "Do you miss what your life was before?" "My rented room," she said. "My solitary existence." "Your independence," he said carefully. She thought about it. "I was independent because I had to be," she said. "There is a difference between independence you chose and independence you make the best of. I made the best of mine." She paused. "This is better. That does not feel like a concession to me. It feels like honesty." He looked at her steadily. "I want you to tell me," he said, "if there are things you want that you do not have, if there are ways this life is wrong for you, I want you to say so." "I know," she said. "That is one of the things about you that She stopped. "What?" he said. She looked at the fire. "That I love," she said, completing the sentence with the directness she had always employed, though this particular sentence had taken her longer than most to finish. "That I love," she repeated more clearly. "You. I want to be plain about that, since I am not always as plain about it as you deserve." The piece of wood he was working on stopped moving. He looked at her, and in the firelight his eyes were warm and entirely unguarded, all the quiet reserve that was his natural manner simply absent, nothing between her and what he felt. "I love you," he said. "I have loved you since that first afternoon in your kitchen when you looked at me like you were determining exactly what I was made of." "And what were you?" she said. "Something that wanted to be worth your opinion of it," he said. She looked at him across the fire, this man who had driven up her road with lumber she had not asked for, who had knelt on her broken hallway and treated her nephew's assistance as though it mattered, who had ridden through an ice storm to check on her, who had held her brother's youngest child's hand on Sunday walks without remark, who had built her children a crib and a garden fence and a porch, and asked for nothing in return that she had not wanted to give freely. She got up from her chair and went and sat beside him on the bench by the fire, and he put his arm around her and she leaned against him, and they were quiet together, while the fire burned down and the snow fell softly outside, and the house held them all in its warm and steady shelter. Spring of 1885 came as it always did, with its extravagant sudden greenness and its long days and its particular smell of Oklahoma earth coming back to life. True to their word, they involved all three children in the planting of the Ellsworth farm that year, end to end. Clara took notes. Eli paid close attention to the technical aspects of seed depth and row spacing, and asked questions about soil drainage that showed he had been thinking about it since the previous autumn. James planted enthusiastically and imprecisely, and had to be followed by Eli, who corrected his spacing, which James accepted without rancor. Young Thomas, who was 1 year old and newly walking, attended the planting operations from the safe harbor of a blanket spread at the edge of the field, from which position he observed everything with gray-eyed seriousness, and ate a quantity of grass that concerned Abigail and amused Levi. Pete Dawson had married over the winter, and his wife, a practical and cheerful woman named Ruth, had taken on the cook's role at the Ellsworth farm on the days they were all working the land together, and she and Abigail developed a comfortable working friendship over the course of that summer that eventually deepened into something genuine. The Ellsworth farm began producing in a way it had never quite managed under Thomas's management, not because Thomas had been a poor farmer, but because 2 farms worth of knowledge and 2 farms worth of labor applied to the same acreage made a tangible difference. By the end of the 1885 season, they were discussing what crops they would expand the following year, and Clara had opinions about this that she presented at the supper table in the manner of someone who has done her research. "She is going to be formidable," Levi said quietly to Abigail one evening after Clara had finished presenting her case for increasing the kitchen garden's output and selling the surplus at the Morrow Crossing market. "She already is," Abigail said. In the autumn of 1885, Eli turned 9 and asked Levi, on a Saturday morning when they were mending harness in the barn, if he could learn to handle a team of horses properly. Not just lead a single horse, he clarified, but drive a team. Levi assessed him the way he assessed everything, honestly and without condescension. "You are old enough," Levi said. "We will start this week." Eli received this with a gravity that broke into a rare full smile just for a moment before he reassembled his composure. By November, Eli could drive the team competently enough to take a load to the lumber yard in town and back, with Levi beside him but with his hands on his own knees rather than the reins. Gerald Potts saw Eli pull the wagon to a stop in front of the store with the team well in hand, and said to Levi, "That boy is going to be something." "He already is," Levi said, which was what Abigail had said about Clara, and she heard it later from Gerald Potts, and it gave her a warmth she carried around for the rest of the week. In December of 1885, Abigail told Levi she was expecting again. This time she told him sooner, within a week of being certain, because she had discovered that sharing things with him early was better than being privately certain alone, the way she used to manage things. He received the news the same way he had received the first, with a stillness and then a joy that was entirely genuine and uncalculated. "Another one," he said. "Another one," she confirmed. He pulled her into his arms and held her, and she felt his breath against her hair and his hand steady on her back, and thought that whatever she had once accepted as her portion in life had turned out to be a preliminary draft of something much finer. Clara's response, when told, was to immediately begin planning. Eli said he hoped it was a boy because there were already enough girls, which statement was received with a look from Clara that suggested she considered this view to require correction. James said he wanted it to be named after him, which was diplomatically addressed. Young Thomas, who was 1.5 and largely operating in his own universe, said something emphatic and incomprehensible, and banged a wooden spoon on the table. The winter of 1885 into 1886 passed in the warm, ordinary rhythm of a household that had found its footing. Christmas was large again, with neighbors and the Dawsons and Reverend Collins and Mrs. Carver, and a quality of celebration that was specific to people who have come through difficulty and know what they have on the other side of it. Levi gave Abigail a pair of gloves he had traded for in town, soft leather, perfectly fitted because he had traced her hand on paper without her knowing while she was sleeping on a Sunday afternoon. She found this out later when Clara told her with great pleasure, and she looked at her husband and said, "You traced my hand." "Your hands are cold in winter," he said. "You are not ashamed of that at all," she said. "No," he said. She put on the gloves. They fit perfectly. She wore them to church that Sunday and to the market and to everywhere she went for the rest of the winter. And she thought every time she put them on that love, real love, showed itself most clearly not in the large gestures, but in the particular attention that a person pays to what you need before you know how to ask for it. The second baby came in late July of 1886. It was a girl, and she arrived considerably faster than young Thomas had, which was a mercy, and she was smaller but no quieter, and had an immediate and authoritative presence that Mrs. Holliday said was the mark of a child who knew her own mind. They named her Sarah Rose Hayes, the first name for Thomas's wife, the children's mother, because she deserved to be remembered and to live on in something that breathed. The middle name for the roses that Abigail had planted along the south fence of the kitchen garden that spring, which had come up lavishly and fragrant in June, and which she had tended with particular care. Clara held her namesake's memory in this new small person, with a seriousness that told Abigail everything she needed to know about how much Clara still carried her mother inside her. Eli was gentler with this baby than he had been with Thomas, perhaps because a sister required different handling, or perhaps because he was 10 now and understanding things in a different dimension. James was simply devoted in the way he was devoted to everything he loved. Young Thomas regarded his new sister with the look of someone encountering a phenomenon that requires study before conclusions can be drawn. The Morrow Crossing of 1886 was not the same small, struggling town it had been when Abigail first came to the Oklahoma Territory. The railroad had come through that year, laying its iron line through the flat land 20 miles to the north, and with it came more settlers and more commerce and a slow transformation of the territory's social and economic character. New families arrived. A second general store opened, which Gerald Potts regarded with competitive alarm, and which Abigail regarded as a natural development that she had no particular feelings about beyond practical interest in what they stocked. Levi had added to the Stratton property that year, purchasing an adjacent parcel of 30 acres from a family that had decided Oklahoma was not for them after 2 dry summers. This made their combined land, counting the Ellsworth farm, a substantial operation by the territory's standards. On a September afternoon, Levi was in town at the land office finishing the paperwork on the new parcel when he ran into a man he had not seen since Missouri, an old friend named Daniel Park, who had come west with his wife and young family on the tide of new settlement. Daniel was looking at land, and Levi spent an afternoon with him, walking him around the territory and telling him what he had learned about what the Oklahoma soil would and would not sustain. He brought Daniel and his wife Eleanor home for supper, because that was the kind of thing Levi did, and Eleanor Park and Abigail took to each other with the immediate recognition of 2 women who are both direct-spoken and interested in the world, and have found such women rare. By the end of the evening, they had established the basis of a friendship that would over the following years become one of the most important of Abigail's adult life. The Parks settled 4 miles north and built their own start, and the 2 families became neighbors in the genuine sense, the kind that help each other through harvests and illnesses and the ordinary and extraordinary difficulties of frontier life. By the time the spring of 1887 arrived, Abigail Ellsworth Hayes, which was the name she used when she needed the full weight of it, was 29 years old and had lived through more than most women twice her age. She had lost her brother and her sister-in-law. She had stepped into the void left by their dying and held 3 children above the surface of life by the sheer force of her will and her capable hands. She had lived alone in a house with a broken floor and a leaking roof and debts she had not created, and not for one day had she let the children see her despair. And then a man had driven up her road with lumber, and the rest of it had followed from there. On a warm May evening in 1887, she sat on the extended porch with the baby Sarah on her lap, sound asleep, and watched the Oklahoma dusk come down over the land. The garden was planted, the fields were seeded, the barn was well stocked, and from inside the house she could hear the sounds of her family. Clara at the kitchen table helping Eli with his school arithmetic in a voice of patient authority, James explaining something at length to young Thomas, who was 2.5 and a dedicated audience, Levi's boots on the new floor as he moved from the kitchen to the main room. He came out onto the porch and sat beside her. He looked at the sleeping baby in her arms and then at the land in the evening light. "The corn is coming up well in the east field," he said. "I saw it this morning," she said. He was quiet for a moment. The evening was warm and the sky was turning from blue to the deep rose of dusk, and a meadowlark was doing what meadowlarks do at this hour, which is sing as though the business of singing is the most important thing in the world. "Abigail," he said. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "Are you happy?" She looked back at him, at the gray eyes that were still clear and direct and honest, at the jaw that was the same as it had been the day he drove up the road, at the face that was more familiar to her now than her own, because you see the people you love more clearly than you see yourself. "I'm the happiest I have ever been," she said, in the most ordinary and specific way, not the kind of happy that is about excitement or novelty, the kind that comes from having the thing you need and knowing that it is real and that it is staying. He reached over and took her hand around the sleeping baby and held it the way he always held it, completely. "Good," he said. Which was exactly the right word. Inside, Clara's arithmetic lesson had concluded and been replaced by some kind of disagreement between James and Thomas that was reaching a pitch that would shortly require intervention. Levi stood, unhurried, and went inside to see to it, and through the window Abigail could hear the low, steady sound of his voice calming the situation down with an economy of words and a firmness without anger. She rocked gently on the porch with the sleeping Sarah, and looked at the fading sky, and thought about the morning she had stood behind the Ellsworth house with her hands flat against the wall, breathing through a kind of fear that had no edges because it extended in all directions. She had not known then what would come. She had only known that she would keep going because those 3 small people required it and because she was not built for anything else. And then the lumber had come, before she asked, because a man she had not yet met had driven past her house 3 times and paid attention, which was the first and most essential form of love, noticing. Clara came to the door. "Thomas bit Eli," she reported. "He is too," Abigail said. Eli did not appreciate the distinction, Clara said. Abigail rose and transferred the baby to Clara's arms, which Clara received with the practiced ease of 10 months of practice. She went inside into the warm lamplight of the house that Levi had made sound, through the main room with its solid pine floor that had been her first knowledge of him, and she went to where her husband was kneeling beside 2-year-old Thomas, explaining in his even voice the reasons why biting was not an acceptable form of communication, and Eli was standing nearby with his arms crossed and a look of injured dignity. And the house smelled like supper and wood smoke, and the particular warm human smell of many people who belong together in a space. She put her hand on Levi's shoulder as she passed him. He reached up and briefly covered her hand with his without breaking his conversation with Thomas. She went to Eli and said quietly, "He is too." Eli's expression shifted from injured to reluctantly amused. "I know," he said. "Your father was bitten by a dog once and he was annoyed about it for 3 days, she said. Eli looked at her. "Really, really," she said. "So it is a very natural response." Eli's mouth curved. "I am not as annoyed as he was about the dog," he conceded. "Good man," she said. The evening resolved itself, as evenings in this house generally did, into peace. The children had their supper and their baths. Young Thomas, having been forgiven by Eli with the speed that characterized sibling grievances among children, fell asleep before his head fully met the pillow. James requested and received one story, which Clara told because she was best at them. Sarah slept through everything with the serenity of a baby who has concluded that the world is safe. And later, when the house was quiet and the lamp was low and the Oklahoma night was outside the window with its vast and indifferent stars, Abigail lay beside Levi in the dark and thought that this was the thing she had not known how to ask for because she had not known it was possible. Not just to survive, which she had been prepared to do indefinitely, but to have this, a full house and a sound floor and a man whose gray eyes told the truth and whose hands built things that lasted. She had never written Thomas a letter after he died because he was dead and letters cannot be delivered there. But if she could have, she thought she would have told him that his children were fine, better than fine. That Clara was 10 years old and already forming plans for her inheritance with the same forward-looking practicality that had always been Thomas's strongest feature. That Eli was serious and capable, and was becoming a farmer and a craftsman with equal aptitude. That James was growing into his father's humor and his mother's warmth, and that he had Thomas's way of saying affectionate things directly and without self-consciousness, which was the best of Thomas's qualities. That young Thomas James Hayes had his great uncle's name and a portion of his spirit, or so she believed. She would have told him that she had been afraid at the beginning. Profoundly afraid in the way you can only be when the people who need you are too young to protect themselves, and the thing standing between them and the world is only you. She would have told him that the fear had not broken her, because she was an Ellsworth and Ellsworths did not break, but that it had been very close on some mornings. And she would have told him about Levi Hayes, who had driven up the road with lumber, and who had knelt on the broken hallway and taken Eli seriously, and who had held James's hand on Sunday walks, and who had traced her hand on paper while she was sleeping because her hands were cold in winter. She would have told Thomas, I found a good one, a genuinely good one, the kind you were. Levi's breathing had deepened beside her, the even rhythm of sleep. She listened to it, the way you listen to things you are grateful for. Outside, a night bird called once and was quiet. The Oklahoma land lay out in all directions, dark and enormous and patient, the same land that had received their seed and returned its harvest, that had held this house up for decades through drought and storm and the ordinary relentless difficulty of frontier life. The same land where Thomas had worked and hoped and built a family that had survived him, carried forward by the people who loved him. The floor beneath this house was sound. The roof would hold. The larder was full. The children were sleeping. Abigail Ellsworth Hayes closed her eyes. It was enough, more than enough. It was everything. Outside the window, the Oklahoma stars continued their ancient and indifferent work, which was to shine on everything equally, on the hard and the easy, on the grieving and the grateful, on the broken floors and the mended ones, on the people who drove up roads with lumber before they were asked, and on the women who let them in. The meadowlark, which had gone quiet at dusk, would be singing again by morning. And Abigail would hear it from this house, with these people, in this life that had turned out to be larger and warmer and more solid than anything she had known how to ask for. Which was, she had come to understand, exactly what love was, the thing that arrived before you knew the words for what you needed and stayed.